Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Sentinel Report. I'm your guest host for today, Andrew Muller, Chief of Operations at Alex Newman's Liberty Sentinel, also a contributor over at The New American, in my opinion, the greatest magazine in the United States, where Alex, of course, serves as a senior editor. And I'm going to be hosting the show today for the full hour as Alex is out on assignment, and I'm very happy to be with you all here today. Typically, as you know, loyal viewers of the show will recognize that we typically have multiple guests, various subjects, a news segment. But today's going to be a little different. Today, we're going to spend the whole hour on one subject with two very special guests because I think it's a subject that needs to be addressed and isn't being addressed, particularly by Gen Z. And that is the rise of Nicholas J. Fuentes, the Groypers, potential dictatorship in the United States, and much more. So we are going to get into that. But before we do, we're going to start the show as we always do with a word from the Word. Today, we are getting into Hebrews 4:13, where the scripture says, "And no creature is hidden from his sight, but we are all naked and exposed to the eyes of him whom we must give an account." And of course, this is very important to recognize that we are going to actually have to give an account to God for not only what we did, but what we did not do with the time and the resources that God has given us. So make sure you make every day count and you recognize that what you do and don't do, you will give an account to God. And ultimately, you need to be right with him through salvation with his son, Jesus. Now, before the show, I want to give a shout out to one of our great sponsors. This is Heritage Defense. As you know, Alex is a big fan of Heritage Defense. They are a great legal advocate for not only home educators, but all parents, because 37% of all children will be involved with Child Protective Services at some point in time before they turn 18. And over 83% of these children, which are involved in Child Protective Services, were determined not to be victims of child abuse or neglect. Yet for innocent families, of course, the punishment is often the process. Now, CPS is particularly weaponized against homeschoolers, as you might have some Karen neighbor who doesn't like that you didn't vaccinate your children, or they think you're abusing your kids by not socializing them or something like that. So they call CPS. Well, what Heritage Defense exists to do is they provide a whole host of lawyers that are very well trained and intelligent that are at your beck and call, which you can reach out to if you ever have any sort of interaction with Child Protective Services. So don't wait until you have a social worker at your door. Become a member now before it's too late. Go to heritagedefense.org right now to join. That's heritagedefense.org. Alex Newman is a member and highly recommends the service, and I would to you as well. So let's get into today's show. I want to bring on Daniela Pentsack and Joseph Wargo. These are two great individuals. I actually had the opportunity to spend some time with them recently at Charlie Kirk's Turning Point USA AmFest in Phoenix, Arizona. And while we were there, we encountered a lot of interesting folks. Most of them were patriots, but one interesting standout of the event was the rise of the Groypers and Nicholas J. Fuentes. It appeared every single major speaker, Ben Shapiro, Tucker Carlson, Megyn Kelly, Russell Brand, all these individuals, one way or the other, brought up Nicholas Fuentes, the Groypers, this movement that is growing on the right. And some of them were condemning it. Some of them were speaking more highly of this movement, saying we need to hear these people out and have open and free debate. But nonetheless, it was a talking point that was consistent throughout the whole duration of AmFest. And this isn't just some little trend or a fad that's going on in conservatism. It's actually becoming an extraordinarily, in my opinion, damaging tangent, particularly captivating young people who follow Nick Fuentes, and his followers are called Groypers. This is based off of kind of a, as I understand it, a variation of Pepe the Frog, which is a frog meme. The Groypers are a particular type of Pepe, and the Groypers have really infiltrated many elements of the conservative movement. And when you hear about the Groypers or Nicholas Fuentes, a lot of people think of, anti-Semitism or misogyny or racism. But it appears that a lot of that is simply window dressing to get people's attention. And at the core, at the base of this movement is ultimately kind of a dictatorial alt-right sort of authoritarianism, which doesn't seek to restore constitutional order or the vision of the founding fathers or getting good constitutionalists in Congress, but instead has this idea of we need to get some sort of a dictator, some sort of a CEO, as Curtis Yarvin would say, in the White House to usher in a new era of an American empire. Now, the trouble with that is most dictatorships don't work. And before we get to Daniela and Joseph, I want to show you that this isn't just some tangent that we're pulling out of our hats. The Rolling Stones rolled this headline just a couple weeks ago. This was actually in December. The war over Nick Fuentes is over. He won. And then I think even more disturbingly, the New York Times ran a headline shortly after the martyrdom of Charlie Kirk saying Nick Fuentes was Charlie Kirk's bitter enemy. Now he's becoming his successor. So obviously people are paying attention to this. They're taking it extraordinarily seriously. And it's something we need to do as well. So Daniela, I'll begin with you. Just from your research, what's your 30,000-foot view of Nick Fuentes? What do you think he believes? And what do the people need to know about this Groyper movement?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for having me on today, Andrew. I really appreciate it. I have been aware of this movement for quite a few years now. I've been seeing it happen. I don't know if I would say since the very beginning, but from one of the more earlier stages. And, it is an ever evolving process. And what I typically say on my show, actually, is that the movement, I believe, has grown beyond Nick Fuentes. And Nick Fuentes is representative of it. He was like, ground zero for it. But the people in the movement has, I think, evolved beyond what he is. And the main tenets of the movement, if people are asking more specifically, is some of the things that you have already pointed out, which is like the Jewish influence over many aspects of American institutions, for instance. And Nick Fuentes, anyone that watches him will be relatively exposed to that information that he's saying. And a lot of this is like the internal skepticism about the major institutions that we have grown up with. And what Nick Fuentes typically likes to do, and what he says, is that this is all due to Jewish influence. And he gives his arguments for that. But what I think is at the core of the movement, especially though, is not just that, that this growing skepticism among all major institutions shared by predominantly young men, although the movement is colored by some women as well. But it's mostly young men, I would say generally between the ages of 20 to maybe 26, around that age group. And maybe a little bit older now as, generations are progressing. But this disgruntled nature that young men have, being growing up within the United States and the United States culture within like the last 20 years or so, they're getting tired of the decline that some of us have been seeing in modernity. And so they're responding to this in a very extreme way, which is what we're seeing with Nick Fuentes. And Nick Fuentes, he was one of the few that when he was on the mainstream online, including YouTube, when he used to do his YouTube channel, he said the things that no one would ever hear in mainstream media. And I think that's what got him the most popular immediately, because this is something that younger people would not see. And so I think that's what propelled him into, not in a mainstream nature for like the first few years of the duration of his movement, but he certainly got banned on many platforms, but he's still growing. And I think it is this disgruntled nature that he has tapped into that is getting more people, especially young men, interested in him. I hope that answers your question. But that's like generally, I would say, like the abstract nature of this movement.
Exactly. I couldn't agree with you more. And, forgive me, audience. I forgot to properly tee up Daniela. She's the John Birch Society's social media director. She's a political writer and the host of Culturama, which is a great show over on Rumble. You need to check it out. Definitely a rising star. So I want to turn to you, Joseph, and pose the same question. Nick Fuentes has really caused a lot of publicity for his show. And I think a lot of it could be attributed to the Streisand effect, right? Where people talk about it and they say, hey, this is crazy. They share little clips. It's flash in the pan clips. Him talking about women need to shut up and Jews control society and blacks need to go to jail for the most part. Joseph, you're a former Turning Point USA Action Field representative. You're a member of the John Birch Society, as am I, a great organization, and we'll get into the JBS, and an anti-communist organizer. You are you're not shy to these sorts of, characters who present themselves as movers and shakers, draw attention. You've studied this. What do you really think Fuentes is getting at? Is the anti-Semitism, the misogyny, the racism really what he's all about? Or is that just a front to get people to pay attention to a show, to bring about a deeper movement? Or is it really just that shallow?
Yeah, so I think that what your guys' analysis is pretty spot on in a lot of ways. It is mainly a movement rooted in resentment. I've seen a lot of Groypers in my time. You go working on college campuses, you meet a lot of young men. They're disgruntled, they're angry, they want to know what's going on. They have questions about what's going on, they don't get answers. And so they turn to people like Nick Fuentes, who does provide an answer, even if it's not really sufficient, it's not the whole truth. And I think that when you say, what is the core of his movement? Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the shock jockery. It's easy to get caught up in the racism, misogyny, and anti-Semitism. But I think that primarily the racism and misogyny are actually mostly just window dressing. The root being resentment of his movement is that he wants to solve these problems, so to speak. He wants someone like a strong man to come in and just change the system. Hitting nail on the head is that he's an authoritarian at heart. I do think that the two things that kind of are core to his worldview, based on what I've seen, is that he truly has resentment and anger against what he perceives as his persecution by a Jewish-controlled political system. And he believes that a strongman authoritarian will come and is necessary to come to resolve the issues of that system.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And it's interesting that you use the word resentment, because I think that is exactly what we're dealing with here. And we know that the communists, the globalists, the conspirators who want to destroy America and American sovereignty, these people are in the Council on Foreign Relations, they're in the United Nations, they're in the World Economic Forum. These are the insiders that we would call generically the deep state. They take people like Fuentes, or they take movements like Black Lives Matter or Antifa or what have you, and they take, kind of low IQ people who have, some surface level points that are somewhat, maybe justifiable regarding the particular treatment of their class or their particular treatment of their race. And then they take those and they foment revolutions. They foment division. And through that, they try to bring about societal discord, societal unrest, societal revolution, to then be able to usher in some sort of radical policy or radical administrative state. And those individuals, through BLM or Antifa or the Groypers, just end up being tools of the greater deep state to bring about their purposes. And Robert Welch, who's the founder of the John Birch Society, actually pulled his book, one of the books written about him. This was G. Edward Griffin's biography of him. Welch said in a speech called "The Truth in Our Time," that the insiders, quote, learned to foment, nourish, magnify, and utilize every natural division among men, whether based on race, color, language, or religion, to create strife ranging from a precinct's political feud to a major war between nations, to stimulate and control both sides of such bitter division among mankind, and to profit enormously from the opportunities thus offered to them to grasp more power amid the resulting chaos, resignation, and despair. And I think that's very an apt description to a part of the Groyper movement, is that you see Fuentes and his followers taking a somewhat legitimate issue, which is, let's say, infiltration in the United States by foreign powers. We know that's real. We know that happens. For example, AIPAC, the American Israeli Political Action Committee, has an unjust influence on American politics. They're also not registered under the Foreign Agent Registration Act, known as FARA. And that's a legitimate problem, right? That's a real issue. It actually does have consequences. However, to say that that is the indication of the whole conspiracy, or that Jews are the, people behind the conspiracy solely, is a tangent. We know that's not true. We know that the deep state is comprised of atheists, of Buddhists, of jihadists, of even people who claim Christianity, of a whole host of individuals. But what they all have in common is they want power. They want to move from individualism to collectivism. They want to centralize authority in a nationalized way, and ultimately an international way, to erode national sovereignty and the dream of Americanism. So I think that's what we're dealing with here with the Groypers. So I want to show a little bit of what Fuentes actually believes, just beyond the normal clips. We're not even going to get into those because it's so overdone. People are constantly showing the clips of him talking about women and the Jews and various races. And I don't want to give more attention to that than it's worth, because like you said, Joseph, it really is window dressing. But to understand how Fuentes came to prominence, at least in our typical recent history, is really the interview he did with Tucker Carlson. That to me seemed to be a real turning point, if you will, in the Groyper discourse that we're having in the conservative or paleocon or right-wing movement. is really that interview that took place with Tucker Carlson, because this is where he was platformed, according to James Lindsay, or he was platformed, according to Mark Levin and Ben Shapiro, and was kind of ushered into the movement as a credible voice. And even the president of the United States played into this and talked about it outside of Air Force One. Here's Donald Trump saying, hey, if Tucker interviews Fuentes, get the word out. Here is clip 3.
Tucker Carlson recently had a friendly interview with anti-Semite Nick Fuentes. Tucker Carlson. What role do you think Tucker Carlson should play in the Republican Party and the conservative movement going forward?
Well, I found him to be good. I mean, he said good things about me over the years. I think he's good. We've had some good interviews. I did an interview with him. We had 300 million hits. You know that. Look, I can't tell him.
Should he be?
Will you let me finish my statement? You are the worst. You're with Bloomberg, right? You are the worst. I don't know why they even have you. We've had some great interviews with Tucker Carlson, but you can't tell him who to interview. I mean, if he wants to interview Nick Fuentes, I don't know much about him, but if he wants to do it, get the word out. Let him, people have to decide. Ultimately, people have to decide.
So that sent a shockwave, the interview and the president's, lack of, going against it, and Fuentes sent a shockwave throughout Con Inc. and conservatism and the Nat Cons, because their approach to Fuentes is avoid him, don't talk about him, totally cast him to the shadows. But that actually gives him an element of, this kind of power of this secret knowledge. And then people go to him and they look and they see, well, if he's being shadow banned or he's not being acknowledged, therefore he has to have some legitimate points. And that brought a lot of people over to Nick. He was one of the top live streamers on Rumble last year. And then you had Tucker Carlson in the interview. And now you have Patrick Bet-David interviewing Nicholas Fuentes. You have Steven Crowder interviewing Nicholas Fuentes. I see Tim Pool on Timcast is now having Nicholas Fuentes on his show next week. So these bigger names are starting to have him on. And that all, in my opinion, at least from my knowledge, started with Tucker interviewing Fuentes. So we're just about to hit an ad break here. And then on the other side, I want to get into more of your guys' analysis of this. But once Tucker interviewed Fuentes and they started having this discussion, Tucker didn't push back on Fuentes, which was one of the big critiques that people gave of Tucker's. They said you didn't push back on the authoritarianism, and you just spent time on, as Daniela said, the young men who seem to be disengaged from the political system and how Fuentes reaches them. So with all that context, just kind of teeing all of this up, we are going to get into what Fuentes really believes, what he thinks about dictatorship and authoritarianism, and why I believe, and I think Daniela and Joseph will agree, that the John Birch Society's method of handling the deep state is superior. So we're going to get into that. We're going to get a lot more thoughts from Daniela and Joseph on the other side of this break.
Life's just better with VNI. There's purpose, there's passion, and there's a renewed sense of inspiration and optimism with every day. After all, we were founded on the power of possibility. Nearly a decade ago, a team of world-class scientists, formulators, and industry makers brought together biology, chemistry, and technology and created something unique and life-changing, while infusing a new sense of health and hope into the world. With every product comes an empowering opportunity to take charge of our destiny. One where we feel rejuvenated and energized, and everything else around us feels lighter, brighter, and full of promise. Let's live victoriously, together.
All right, welcome back. Thank you for staying over the break, and we do appreciate you checking out our sponsors and supporting the show. It keeps us going. So let's now get into Fuentes and what I think is the main objective, which is kind of this authoritarian fetish. So Daniela, let's start with you, and we can play some clips here too. Is that Fuentes has kind of taken what Curtis Yarvin articulated and Nick Land articulated through the Dark Enlightenment and made it this whole idea of dictatorship, but it's different. Fuentes' version of it's different than Nick Land and Curtis Yarvin. He's a little bit more on the kind of Hitlerian authoritarianism. At least that's what he, frames it as, according to his own words, which we'll listen to. Do you think that is a genuine desire amongst Zoomers, is to have an authoritarian running the United States of America?
No, I mostly would say I don't think they really know what they want. Generation Z especially is the generation that's been raised with the most broken families, with the most single mothers. Generation Z especially was, I think, the first generation in the United States that has been raised with having to move more consistently within their lives and change schools. The lowest church attendance has been experienced by Generation Z parents and families. And also on top of that, we have this consistent issue of frequent immigration happening in our country, and it's frankly destabilizing our country culturally. And so what you're seeing is that Generation Z has been largely raised in a very destabilized, inconsistent culture, and that was their primary experience. And I think that particularly with younger people these days in the United States, they're looking for a figure that provides them at least some understanding or conceptual understanding of what stability looks like. So you see Nick Fuentes talk frequently about going to church. He's Catholic. He's very outspoken Catholic. Going to church, having a monoculture in the United States, all these things. But on top of that, he also has these, as Joseph pointed out, window dressing on top of it to make it look like that he has this esoteric knowledge that he can talk about that no one can talk about in the mainstream. But so I think that's essentially why people, especially young men, are really attracted to his message. It's because even though Nick Fuentes claims that he wants to put forth a more authoritarian system, and that's what they want, I think what the younger people of the United States and Generation Z, that's what they think they want. That seems to illustrate what they seek, is that stability, is that unification. But ultimately, I think no person wants to live in an authoritarian regime system. And also, I do want to add that even though Nick Fuentes speaks like this and he speaks for a system like this, he never really gets into the particulars, like so many people, about how exactly this would work. So he may try to run his movement that way. He may try to, which additionally, I wouldn't say he does a very good job, because the Groyper movement is becoming more factionalized now, I would say, but that's a different story. But he is more of an iconoclast, and that's what he describes himself as. And I think particularly within the United States, with our culture of liberty, and he poses this question, how we need a more authoritarian regime system, he's sort of hitting against the iconoclast of or he's being the iconoclast and he's hitting back against the icon of the United States that we so frequently uphold, which is liberty. And so I think that's essentially what's going on here. But I wouldn't say that people, even Generation Z young men, want the system that he's proposing.
Well, and I think he takes a lot of issues, and I agree with you, by the way, he takes a lot of issues that people resonate with: mass migration, degeneracy in our culture. And he says that these are problems we're dealing with. And of course, he's right. I mean, the vast majority of issues Fuentes identifies, not the racism, misogyny, and Jewish stuff, but when you actually get into like what he talks about regarding H-1B visas and, white Christians being replaced by the foreign world and, foreign invasion and foreign intervention and all that kind of stuff. The diagnosis is correct, but then the solutions are very dodgy, to say the least. It's, we need to have an authoritarian. So I want to play a clip of Fuentes calling for a dictator, and then we'll get Joseph's reactions and thoughts to this. This is cut number 4.
You got to recognize the fact that this is a godless country. I hate it. It's immoral. It's wrong. It's heinous. It's evil. But this is an evil country. And this country will surprise you with how evil it is. And that's why you got to get this out of your head, that there is some silent majority cavalry that's going to come out of the woods and save us at the last minute. It's not. When we meet the left on the battlefield and they outnumber us like 5-1, that's it. But the point is, when you look at these things like abortion, it's popular. People like abortion, hate it, but it's true. And you can thank the Jewish media for that. Abortion's popular. Sodomy's popular. Being gay is popular. Being a feminist is popular. Sex out of wedlock is popular. Contraceptives are, it's all popular. That's all. That's not to say it's good. That's not to say I like that. Popular means the people support it, which they do. And and it sucks, and it is what it is, but that's why we need dictatorship. That's unironically why we need to get rid of all that. We need to take control of the media or take control of the government and force the people to believe what we believe, or force them to play by our rules.
Yeah, force them to play by our rules, reshape the society. And that's kind of what he does, is he identifies all these issues, and then he says we need a quick fix, because if we don't have a quick fix, we're going to get trampled. So, Joseph, what do you think of that? Do you think that that's resonating with young men? What could go wrong with that sort of ideology? What's your take and reaction to that?
Yeah, well, so kind of to tie back to what you asked originally of Daniela, which is that do Gen Z, do they really support an authoritarian regime? No, I don't think Gen Z specifically supports an authoritarian regime. What Gen Z supports is somebody solving these problems. And so if Congress were to solve those problems, if the president were to solve those problems, if anarchy were to solve those problems, that's what Gen Z trends towards, because they've seen the decades of accumulative rot, and they've seen that things have not worked. So they're really more, Gen Z is not a particularly ideologically firm generation. It is very ideologically pragmatic. So when they hear Nick Fuentes say, I need an authoritarian to come in and change things, to, make it so that gay marriage is just illegal, or to just ban abortion, what he is playing into is a tendency that Gen Z has noticed. And I've had this conversation with a lot of young politically active people on college campuses all the time, which is they notice something like Prop 8 in California. In California, Prop 8 was passed by popular vote, and they banned gay marriage in California, and the judicial system came in and said, we're going to undo this, right? So they see this, and they see that the system does not work exactly as it was presented, as a democracy even, or as a republic. And so they then say, well, I want whatever the solution to this problem is. When the problem is degeneracy, I want the solution to degeneracy. When the problem is usury, I want the solution to usury. And so they are much more pragmatic in their ideology. They're not just going to say, I want authoritarian because I like authoritarianism. It's, I want authoritarian because I've been convinced by figures like Nick Fuentes or Nick Land or Curtis Yarvin that authoritarianism is the solution to my problems.
Yeah, and I agree with you 100%. And I think a big part of this as well is that they see that the system isn't serving them. They see that we have a Congress that, campaigns on being America first or supporting the Trump administration. And then you're into the Trump administration. And what has Congress, what has our various state governments actually done in any sort of meaningful way to codify the mandate of the American people when they voted for Trump and said, hey, let's actually secure our borders, let's stop globalism, let's be America first, let's, put our national interests at the forefront of our discourse, let's stop worrying about the Middle East and Eastern Europe and start focusing on us. That was obviously why Trump won. And then you see our systems of power through our state legislatures, our governors, and all the way up to Congress, Senate, et cetera, they're not following through with that. So people like Fuentes, from my estimation, they take that resentment, as you said earlier, they take that disgruntlement from the youth of the system working against them, of them not fulfilling their promises, and they say, well, we need a more expedited answer. We need a more expedited solution to be able to make America what we want it to be within our own generation. And I've heard Curtis Yarvin, for example, on the Charlie Kirk show, talk about if we're going to go back and have a grassroots movement and elect constitutionalists to Congress, by the time we were able to educate each other and actually mobilize that sort of a movement, the left will have already destroyed the country to the point where we'll never be able to enjoy any sort of meaningful element of freedom in our lifetime. So therefore they say, well, we just need to have a top-down fix, have a dictator who can right a lot of these wrongs. But of course, the problem you run into then is you open this Pandora's box of destroying constitutionalism, destroying the Republican systems of government, and you will never get back to it. Similarly, as we say at the John Birch Society with regards to an Article 5 convention to open up the Constitution and add amendments to it, once you begin that process, you will never be able to return to what was regarding the originalism and beauty of the Constitution as written, because after you begin that process, even though you might have noble ambitions in what you want to add to it, the system and process in the modern day of changing it would distort it so much, would live it out to an extent I don't think anybody even knows what it would look like. And then you've opened this Pandora's box with no possibility of returning. So that's ultimately, I think, the main concern. Now, Newsweek did a study, which I think enforces a lot of what we're talking about here. They said Gen Z is embracing dictatorships. That was the headline. But when you get into the actual study, it's less about dictatorship and it's more about having just a more centralized force in the United States taking care of our issues, where the Supreme Court, for example, or the lower courts can't just come and overturn it. And in the study, they found out that 40% of Gen Zs agreed that a rule by a strong leader, where that leader can make decisions without interference from the legislature or from the courts, would be a good system of government. And furthermore, when they were asked if they thought rule by the military would be a good or bad system for the United States, 26% of Gen Z said it was good. So you definitely see a rise in interest for some sort of leadership in the United States that can just do things without having to deal with the establishment. Daniela, what is your response to that? Do you think that's even feasible? Do you think in the United States today we could elect, let's say, a Nick Fuentes type character who could actually get away with that sort of political action? Or is this really just kind of a deep state conspiracy to bring about a more leftist authoritarianism in the United States and ultimately move away from a Republican system of government?
I think there's pressures on both sides, frankly, but it's very difficult for me to believe that Americans would push this forward or try to get this established, considering the history and culture of the United States and the people that made it so great. People have to understand that these online communities and the communication that's held online, it is very different from what's held in the real world. So, and that's particularly also true of, I would say, Groypers as well, which Joseph has dealt with them and spoken with them. I've spoken with them. And the consistent pattern that I keep seeing is that these individuals, like I said previously, just want some sense of stability, or they also want to see our institutions actually operate correctly in a system that helps them move forward in life. And that doesn't necessarily require an authoritarian or top-down ruler, so to speak. But what I also believe, particularly with, since we are talking about the Groyper or Nick Fuentes movement, is that this is a movement that is focused around a single individual. And it is a movement that is largely comprised of younger men. And what typically happens or occurs, and what I've actually seen happen personally, is that once they mature in life and have, multiple various other experiences, they actually move away from the movement and start to live a more, one could say, offline or normal or even more traditional lifestyle. So I think there is hope, and I take issue with sometimes with these with like legacy media, especially when they report on this, claim that these younger men or just Generation Z in general has no agency to really recognize that and to live a normal life. It's not so much the individuals that are the issue here. I would say it's more the systems that they're reacting to. But that danger is always a risk, absolutely, especially if it consistently is being fomented by media, or Nick Fuentes being platformed now, especially since Charlie Kirk has had an untimely death. And it's very strange that everyone is all of a sudden platforming him, but that's what they're doing. And so they are raising the interest. And even though I take no issue with them platforming Nick Fuentes, this is a topic that should be explored. We should also understand that this is more of a reaction, like we've been just discussing, more reaction of a feeling system than it is people exploring this new idea of what could be American government. And I think if we actually have or build up a system that works in their favor, perhaps then they would be less inclined to explore such possibilities.
Yeah. So I'll pose the same question to you, Joseph. I mean, do you think that we could see in the United States within our lifetime some sort of a manifestation of what Fuentes is talking about? Joe Rogan did a show just a few weeks ago with Shane Gillis, and at the end of the show, Rogan kind of quipped that he thought a Fuentes presidency would be possible within a decade. And it could have been some offhanded comment, but when you have the #1 podcaster in the world talking about that as a possibility, it does show that the Overton window on it, at least people's knowledge of him and the Groypers, is expanding. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so when it comes to an actual inclination for dictatorship amongst Gen Z, I'm always really skeptical of polls, especially there's two reasons. One being that polls tend to be leaned to influence rather than to actually poll. But then two, we have mass demographic replacement in this country. And a lot of these people come from third world countries where authoritarianism is already the norm. So those people are going to poll in the Gen Z demographic. They're going to poll as more inclined towards authoritarianism. And they're first generation here, or maybe they're not even, not even legally here. For multitudes of reasons, those polls can be really dicey. But when it comes to the reality of if it's possible, if Nick Fuentes type figure could be a president in 10 years, I don't think a Nick Fuentes type figure could be the president in 10 years, because Nick Fuentes has positioned himself as outside the system, as Daniela put it, an iconoclast, and his trademark is kind of burning every bridge. A figure like Charlie Kirk could be the president because his whole thing was being an organizer, being a coalition builder. But a figure like Nick Fuentes, his entire identity is wrapped up in burning the bridge after he has had an interview, causing damage to the people that try to align themselves with him. He is against the world and the world is against him. So I don't think a figure like Nick Fuentes could be the president in 10 years. What I do think is possible, and I think Joe Rogan is an interesting thinker because he's a very simple thinker, but he can hit truths because he's simple. I think what he's getting at is that a figure who talks about things which Nick Fuentes talks about could be the president in 10 years. That someone who is inclined towards America first, isolationism, who is maybe inclined more towards a strongman, those sorts of things have been normalized over the past 10 years due to the COVID regime and due to the acceleration of what has been a growing managerial authoritarian state in this country over the past few decades. That kind of figure who comes in, sweeps up the managerialism, that kind of person could be a figure, but it wouldn't be Nick Fuentes. It would be somebody who is inspired by his rhetoric or inspired by his ideas.
Yep, I agree. And I think Daniela, when she said earlier that what Gen Z really wants is stability, is an interesting point. And our politicians have not, even gotten close to, providing stability. When the median age for the first time home buyer in the United States is shot up into the 40s, you can only be 40 years old before you buy a house. We're $38 trillion in debt. And yet we pass massive spending bills to give money to Ukraine, to give money to Israel, to give money to Egypt, to give money to the Saudis. And you have young men who look at that, and then they also see, as you said, Joseph, the importation of the foreign world into our own country, stealing our jobs, H-1B visa workers, et cetera. There's this betrayal, and then you have this resentment, and then this kind of almost knee-jerk reaction to, well, if the system's not going to work for me, we're just going to take over the system whole hog, and install, something of an authoritarian to advocate our ways. So on the other side of the break, I want to play one more clip from Fuentes. We actually have two more. So we'll look at those, and then we'll get into the solutions, what we think is a more excellent way through really the materials of very long-standing organizations such as the John Birch Society, which not only address these issues, but provide actual solutions. So all of that and more on the other side.
Life's just better with VNI. There's purpose, there's passion, and there's a renewed sense of inspiration and optimism with every day. After all, we were founded on the power of possibility. Nearly a decade ago, a team of world-class scientists, formulators, and industry makers brought together biology, chemistry, and technology and created something unique and life-changing, while infusing a new sense of health and hope into the world. With every product comes an empowering opportunity to take charge of our destiny. One where we feel rejuvenated and energized, and everything else around us feels lighter, brighter, and full of promise. Let's live victoriously, together.
All right. Thank you for staying over that break. We are in our final segment here, and we're going to get into some solutions. So I do want to play this clip of Fuentes. He's talking about order being more important than liberty. And if order, it means the death of individualism and more collectivism, then small price to pay. So he says, here's cut 6.
The problem with libertarianism is that liberty is not the highest political virtue. The highest political virtue is order. That is the greatest ordering principle. That is the greatest governing principle, order. Order comes first, liberty comes second, and order has to be maintained by a powerful state. Order has to be maintained by authority. And where does authority proceed from? Force, guns, overwhelming force, power that comes out of the end of a rifle, and legitimacy. The people have to believe in the authority of the state. And if these things are being undermined by freedom, by liberty, then you don't get liberty. And people like to say that Ben Franklin thing about liberty and safety, liberty and safety. It's about order and disorder. Forget about safety and liberty. It's about order and disorder. And what Hobbes writes is that even a bad order is better than disorder, than chaos, than a war of all against all, a total collapse of authority. Because do you know what happens when the power goes out? Rape. Okay? Rape, murder, looting, pillage, marauding, barbarism, an orgy of the crowds, an orgy of violence and chaos and hatred and anger. Okay, it's like the kinds of war crimes in Abu Ghraib. Okay, it's like the kinds of war crimes committed in Vietnam, in Iraq. When you have a total collapse of order, you get things that it's beyond human comprehension. So this is a very free country. This is one of the freest countries to ever exist. And the problem is that those things are starting to become undermined. The authority, the force and the legitimacy that founds the authority of the state, which holds the country together, which enforces the laws. And libertarians, they have a little bit too much faith in people and a little bit too much faith in the individual. I don't believe in the individual. And I'm individualistic, but I'm not an individualist. Individualism only makes sense in a white, Christian, patriarchal society.
Pretty decent summation, I think, of what he believes, which is that we have chaos, we have disorder, we have, pornography and abortion and the foreign world coming into our country, and we have all these issues. So therefore, we need to establish order by any means necessary, and therefore we need to have, some sort of a dictatorship to usher that in. Now, what I would respond to is that I agree, but I think the order we need to seek is the order which has worked in this country, which is going back to a Republican constitutional system of government where the people, through their representatives, under the chains of the Constitution, order our affairs rather than a single head under an executive. And I'm not against an ambitious executive in so much as the Federalist Papers explained, having an ambitious executive to execute the laws. However, to have an executive that, trounces the legislature, for example, or acts with unilateral authority, or even compromises state sovereignty, that would be an issue because, as Lord Acton, posited, that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and there's hardly any instance in history of any sort of meaningful dictatorship lasting in prosperity for generations. They typically always have collapsed, and that was the beauty of the American system, which is that, yes, the people had authority. Ultimately, God was our king, and we, the people, took authority and we limited it in a document called the United States Constitution and set up a system of government to preserve order and protect our God-given rights. And that is what I think we need to be getting back to. And if we could get back to that through education, if we could get back to that through grassroots, if we could get back to that through having conversations, I think we actually can retake Congress and can take the White House and all of our various state and local offices. Of course, that's a hard way. It's going to take time. It's going to take organization, but it is feasible. So, Daniela, what do you think about solutions to this? Of course, Groypers and Fuentes and these young men, they have a lot of accurate complaints. A lot of their, complaints, and again, we're not talking about the Jews running society or the misogyny or the racism. That's not what we're talking about. But the issues Fuentes brings up on his show regarding, the foreign world, intervention, etc. These are legitimate critiques. What is the proper solution to that? And give us your thoughts on that, and then bring in the John Birch Society.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first and foremost, what Nick seems to be lacking, and a lot of the people that I suppose agree with him are lacking, are not respecting history. There are plenty of examples in history, like you just stated, Andrew, quite accurately, that there have been dictatorial regime systems, authoritarian regime systems, and they only work for so long. But they're never long lasting. And every time they collapse, and the people greatly suffer in that nation. And so I don't know why Nick Fuentes is so disengaged with that. It's a tale as old as time. And if he was so aware of human nature, because he described human nature and how it's the ruling mob, how destructive it is, which partially is true. But he must also understand that related to human nature is that power corrupts ultimately, and that anyone that does get into major positions of power will eventually be corrupted by that position. So, naturally, I would assume he's aware of that, but who knows? But as a solution, I mean, we all have to understand that due to human nature is that even though maybe some people may feel compelled to be part of a collective system if that ensures their safety, we must also understand that there's a bigger plan happening, and that is the globalist communist network that they're trying to implement on this world. And so we must always retain a sense of our identity as Americans and the history that has carved us or carved our country and our nation into how great into how great that it is today. And unfortunately, we're losing that, considering some policies that we've been suffering under, particularly immigration. But that being said, he is right to say that we have that we need an established order. And Andrew, you just mentioned that with our Republican government and the constitutional system that we have to rely on. And retaining that, I think, like you said, it requires obviously education. I think proper education is the root of all solutions, at least in our country, and I think just in general for most nations. But the problem with so many people, and especially in politics, is that they always want a quick solution, or even just a superficial solution or a band-aid, right? And it never works. And unfortunately, not just in politics, but I think everywhere in life, the proper way to address something and to resolve something is addressing the root problem. And it always is going to be a long and arduous process, but that's the only rewarding process that's going to last. So obviously proper education, being involved in your community, obviously locally, attending church, all these things are components of addressing the problems of our nation. But particularly what the John Birch Society provides is a library of information, of educating ourselves first on the global conspiracy that is happening. And, we have resources out there. We're trying to, at least in the social media department, other parts of the organization, communicate that to people and say that we have very affordable literature. We have all these resources that we can provide to people to educate them on that, and also their communities. Obviously, we have established chapters all across the country. So there's various ways of getting involved. But ultimately, Andrew, I think you hit the nail on the head when you mentioned this, that education is the sole solution, the proper solution, in understanding the truth of what's happening and educating others in that.
Exactly. And it is going to take education. And again, name a top-down solution that ever works. It's always bottom-up solutions in politics that have lasting effects. You can go back and look at the Revolutionary War. That was a bottom-up system where they went and they took out the threat of the British and they rebuilt a country that was independent and established a system of government. And they could have just said, hey, let's make Washington our dictator and have Great Britain 2.0. But they wanted a system of government that had a separation of powers, that because they recognize that power corrupts and that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that's why resources like the John Birch Society is so significant, and they've had such a good history of calling out these tangents and movements like the Groypers. And Gary Allen, who is a Bircher who published this book called None Dare Call It Conspiracy in 1976, I think actually in a sentence really summarized what we're dealing with here. He said this, quote, because of racial or religious bigotry, they, the conspirators, will take small fragments of legitimate evidence and expand them into a conclusion that will support their particular prejudice, i.e., the conspiracy is totally Jewish, Catholic, or Masonic. These people do not help expose the conspiracy, but sadly play into the hands of those who want the public to believe that all conspiratorialists are screwballs, end quote. And I do think that is what Nick Fuentes is contributing to. He takes small elements of, facts, and he says, hey, look at this foreign intervention from Israel, look at AIPAC, and these things are true. But then he blows it into this larger conspiracy that doesn't actually address what we're dealing with here. The conspiracy against the United States isn't Jewish in nature, nor is it Catholic, nor is it Christian, nor is it jihadist. It's ultimately, I'm a Bible-believing Christian, satanic in its nature. It goes back to the Garden of Eden. It goes back to the Tower of Babel, where people want to be as God. They want to have absolute power. They want to exercise dominion over others, and therefore they create internationalist institutions to be able to rule over the world. And that is what we're dealing with. And that group, which is satanically inspired, will use any sort of, religious creed or race or ethnic background to accomplish that conspiracy. And that's what we need to be discussing and fighting against, not discussing just purely the Jews or what have you, and blowing this out of proportion and then saying a dictator is the right response. So, Joseph, I know you have a very well working knowledge of the John Birch Society. If you were talking to a Groyper and they fell down the rabbit hole and they listened to Nick Fuentes and they bought into this whole, reactionism and we need a dictator, how would you talk them off the cliff? What would you say to them regarding the JBS as an alternative solution?
Yeah. So, and I've actually had this conversation before. And what I tend to lean into is that, look, we need to be honest. The two things that have been lacking on the right specifically, but in politics in general in America amongst patriots, is honesty and organization. And so as far as organization is concerned, the John Birch Society is basically the only organization that's going to sit there and tell you this is how you reach into your local community. This is how you influence your politicians. This is how you are a real player in your community so that you can have that bottom-up revolution. But then as far as honesty, the John Birch Society is the only organization that's been totally honest when it's unpopular to everybody. So, a good example today is Martin Luther King Day. And they were at the forefront in 1965, identifying that the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth and Stanley Levinson and Augustus Williams were all communist associates who were associates of Martin Luther King Jr. Now, people are going to sit there and say, well, that's three people from three different groups. They come from very different backgrounds, but all three of them are engaged in a seditious conspiracy to enact communism in the country. And that's kind of what the John Birch Society has been able to do, is not get dragged down by what you call tangents or Robert Welch called tangents, but to be able to say, look, there are specific people. It's not X group, it's not Catholics, it's not Y group, it's not Jews. It is specific people with specific names who are part of specific organizations, and those people are participating in the conspiracy and the different aspects that are degrading.
Yep, that's exactly right. And the John Birch Society has been so good at actually pointing this out that even in our literature all the way back to the mid 20th century, we were actually exposing this movement of young people who perhaps want a dictator, or even old people who want a dictator. One of my favorite illustrations of that expose is the John Birch Society's discussion of Colonel Edward M. House. This was a character who was explained as Woodrow Wilson's alter ego. I think we actually have a picture of Edward House with Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson, by his own words, you can look this up, said that Edward House was his thoughts, his vision, his a brother from another mother, to put it in a catchy phrase. But Colonel Edward House, in addition to being involved in the Federal Reserve and also being involved in a lot of deep state groups, he wrote a book. And that book was titled Philip Drew Administrator. And in the book, it was presented as a fictitious work. But there's this character, Philip Drew, and he's, a mover and shaker, a West Point graduate who leaves the U.S. Army to organize a military revolt against the United States. And he creates a civil war. And the result of that civil war is a dictator. And that dictator creates a welfare society. He creates a Federal Reserve System, a bank. He underwrites American sovereignty, and creates this authoritarian regime in the United States with a New Deal, who acts like Julius Caesar, who creates things like Social Security, a graduated income tax. So we see through the expose of Edward House and his work through Woodrow Wilson that there actually has been a long-standing conspiracy in the United States to foment resentment, to foment even a civil war, to then usher in an authoritarian dictator. And that's just a taste of some of the things that the John Birch Society has been talking about for literally decades, since 1958. So we're running short on time here, but I want to give you both an opportunity to, just in 2 minutes or less, give you your final thoughts. So we'll start with Daniela. What is your final takeaway for the people who are listening to this? Maybe this is their first time hearing about Fuentes and the John Birch Society and these issues and this war that's going on the right now. What are your final thoughts and message to them?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I just want to establish for those people that are listening, perhaps they're a little bit older or they haven't heard of Nick Fuentes before, like you said, Andrew, is that I want people to understand that this is a reaction to the failing systems that we've had to endure for so many years now. And this is what occurs, like you've just mentioned, Andrew, with the Civil War and leading into the authoritarian regime system. This reaction is potentially a danger. But this is what it looks like when systems aren't upheld or institutions aren't upheld in the way that they're supposed to be. And when you don't listen to the cries of a generation. And so unfortunately, they're going to be exposed to these thoughts and it'll become attractive to them. But, obviously there is hope. And like we are mentioning here, through proper education, through getting involved with those institutions, as well as in your communities, there is, of course, a solution on the other end. And like Joseph has mentioned as well, the John Birch Society, and you, Andrew, has been talking about these truths for a very long time and why these institutions are failing. And we've been ignoring these truths. We've been calling these people conspiracy theorists for so many years. And this is the result of that, of not listening to the cries of the previous generations. And so I think moving forward, there is a lot of hope. There is like renewed interest in the John Birch Society. At least I see that from my end on social media. So I think there is a lot of hope. We just have to keep educating and pushing the message.
Final thoughts from you, Joseph.
Stop lying, tell the truth, and organize. If you want Nick Fuentes to be a marginal figure, if you want his ideas to be less popular, tell the truth. Don't lie to young people. Young people aren't stupid. Don't tell them that they're crazy or they're racist or anti-Semitic because they have issues. Don't say that they're spending too much on avocado toast when they can't afford a house. If you want Nick Fuentes to not matter in 10 years, you need to solve these problems by organizing on the grassroots level to influence your local politicians and your state politicians, and you need to tell the truth. And if we do those two things, then I truly believe all of the tools are in place already within our constitutional system to solve the problems that we're facing. The invasion of the southern border can be solved within our constitutional system. The mass demographic replacement of the country can be solved within our constitutional system. We can restore ordered liberty. His false dichotomy of order and liberty is very funny. We can restore ordered liberty where order is in the place to reify liberty and liberty is in place to reify order if, and only if, we are honest and organized.
Couldn't have said it better myself, Joseph. Thank you so much, Daniela and Joseph. Thank you for this great conversation. I encourage people to go to jbs.org and you can learn more, get involved in the fight today. I'm convinced we can actually have our cake and eat it too in this country. We can have a constitutional system of government and also fix the problems before us, but it will take you and I getting involved at the local level and not giving in to top-down, quick, knee-jerk reaction solutions, but actually doing the hard work and doing what has been proven to be successful. Thank you all so much for joining me on this episode of the Sentinel Report. I'm your guest host, Andrew Muller. Alex Newman will be back next week. Until next time, God bless you all.